Thank you so much.
Any other things before we take off? Or are we good?
I think we're good. Yeah, thank you.
Anything gets weird, just let me know where to find us.
Okay, thank you. Oh, what's going on?
Natalie's next to me. Natalie's kind of a liaison at this point, but you know, we can say it's going to be Sunday from our house. Yeah. So just more than I even have to order at 7. So. Okay.
How are you? I need to take this off.
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm
It's
good.
good to see you again.
Y-
You too. So how was the first semester?
I think it's going fine so far. I've been mostly working, doing a lot of classes and working on my syllabus and doing other projects, so it's fine.
Good, good, good. So this is like we're your classmates.
I didn't realize it was.
Why?
I didn't check my email. So someone may not check their email either.
Oh yeah, it's in the email. Okay. What? Oh, okay, sure, yes. Do an introduction. No, go ahead, yeah, sure.
Should we get started? Or?
We can get started.
Okay. So thank you all for coming today. So this particular talk is one of the series of 1230 talks sponsored by Langston Library, and the speaker is going to be and she actually said she's going to be talking about associations between ignorant constructs, physical activity, and childhood obesity, and inspired by that, I brought sugary snacks. So if anybody wants cookies or lemonade or sugary sodas, because if we eliminate obesity, then she has nothing to research. So we here. But anyway, so thank you all for coming.
All right. Hey, everybody. This mic is like really loud. Is there a way to turn it down? Testing, testing. Okay, I think that's better. Testing, testing. All right. So, welcome. Thank you, everyone, for coming to the research talk today, where I'll be presenting. So, I am Kelechi Uzuchukwu, and I'll be presenting my analysis of the associations between neighborhood constructs, physical activity, and childhood obesity, with a focus here on race and income disparities. All right, so the rate of childhood obesity has, since the 1960s, the rate of childhood obesity has risen nearly fourfold. As a result, childhood obesity has evolved from a relatively uncommon societal problem to a national public health crisis. Unfortunately, this epidemic disproportionately affects Black, Hispanic, and low-income children. In fact, the literature overwhelmingly confirms that these groups of children are more likely to be overweight or obese than their white and more affluent counterparts. Some of these studies suggest that also indicate that Black, Hispanic, and low-income children are less physically active than their counterparts. But what factors are contributing to the disparity in physical activity and childhood obesity? Well, depending on the field, your field, you might approach this question from a number of angles. So for those of us that are new at doing research, a question like this could be approached from a medical researcher angle. They might ask questions about the genetic makeup of the child, the biological or family history. A nutritionist, a health professional might ask, what is the child's food intake? What does their diet consist of? But from this field of urban planning, this field of community development in which I'm engaged in, I seek to explore and to uncover whether environmental factors play key roles in understanding this disparity. So I posed three questions, three research questions for this study. The first is, how do the social and physical, the built environment of Black, Hispanic, and low-income children compare to their counterparts? The second question is looking at whether these environmental factors are actually associated with physical activity and obesity. So is there a link there? And then the third question is, if these environmental factors are controlled for, so my stats students, we know what that word control means. Controlled for, if all the race and income groups have the same environments, with Black, Hispanic, and low-income children, will they still have worse health outcomes? So worse. Studies have suggested, and keyword here is suggested, that children's built-in social environments can be attributed to their physical activity levels and their subsequent propensity toward obesity. However, none of these suggestions have been empirically tested. So my study produced these needed empirical results, which I'm happy and excited to share with you today. But before we do, all my students know we have to do a lit review. So let's do the lit review quickly. So one study, we're talking about physical activity and obesity, and so I looked at studies that had to do with children, had to do with sort of their physical activity, and a lot of what I found was about school transportation, how they got to school. So one study about walking or biking to school, one form of physical activity for children, found that poor pedestrian accommodations such as a busy road, no sidewalk, no crosswalks, those types of things decrease children's likelihood of walking or biking to school. So when parents perceived that their environment had unsafe pedestrian accommodations, children were less likely to be physically active. Contrary to this first study, another school transportation study found that underserved communities actually had the highest proportion of children walking and biking to school. Underserved was defined as communities with low access to adequate pedestrian accommodations. So in essence, children in these underserved communities were typically, which typically consists of higher proportions of Black, Hispanic, and low-income children, were more likely to walk to their destinations, mainly out of necessity. Whereas in the communities where pedestrian access was deemed adequate, children were transported by parents or by school bus. And so a third study, and this is just three of there's several that are talked about in the research article to be published in 2017, so look out for that. A third study indicated that access to recreational facilities, parks, playgrounds, rec centers, those types of things were positively correlated with physical activity among children, which physical activity among children. Okay, I'll stop there. So I did the same thing with the social environment. We just talked about the built environment. And a few studies assert that certain features might increase inequalities in health. And these studies asserted that disadvantaged communities were ridden with insecurity, with fear of crime, suffering from the effects of a low position in the socioeconomic hierarchy of society, and the lack of social supports or low social supports. And social supports, as you can see here, were defined as knowing your neighbor, trusting your neighbor, reciprocity, friendliness, that type of thing. So some scholars have found that when parents knew their neighbors, knew people in their neighborhood, children were more likely to walk or bike to school. And so this is what I sort of extrapolate my study to and talk about, well, if they're walking and biking, maybe they're also engaged in other types of physical activity. And so these are the variables I came up with. The built environment variables here I created from the 7 questions in my data set. The first 3 I created, clumped them together and made them an indicator variable for physical detractions. So the question asked whether they had vandalism or graffiti in their home, in their neighborhood, litter or garbage on the streets, poorly kept or dilapidated housing. The next set of questions, more positive physical environment variable, parks, playgrounds, sidewalks, those types of things. So negative aspects and positive aspects of the built environment. And so hypothesizing, like as one would expect, the detractions would, the more detractions you have, right, the lower your likelihood of being obese. Or if we're talking about physical activity, the more detractions you have, the lower your likelihood of being physically active. And then with a positive relationship for amenities, the more amenities, the more likely you are to be physically active, and therefore the lower your likelihood of being obese. Same thing we did here with the social environment. And again, 7 questions, 2 in the detractions indicator variable, asking the parent whether they felt their child was safe at home or in the neighborhood and at school. And then in terms of cohesion, what I call cohesion is if neighbors help each other out, they can count on each other, they trust each other with their children, and so on and so forth. So same pattern here. Higher the detractions, the lower physical activity. The higher your cohesion, the higher your physical activity. So the data is always important. And so to test my hypotheses, I used a nationally representative data set that was compiled in 2011 and 12 called the National Survey on Children's Health. It is the most comprehensive and up-to-date national information currently available for childhood obesity, as well as a number of different health indicators for children. Parents or adult guardians of children ages 0 to 17 were surveyed, there we go, on matters pertaining to their child's health and well-being. So because body mass index, BMI, is typically not measured or recorded for children under age of 10, this study is limited to children ages 10 to 17. And then after much cleaning and much coding, so I do that too, students, I was left from, I think it was 95,000 observations down to 25,000 observations. And a series of descriptive statistics, correlations, logistic regressions, and actually I used some OLS, linear regression modeling, but my main source was this logistic regression modeling. All right, so the data, now that we've gotten all that extra stuff out of the way, we can start talking about what we found, what we as in me, there's only one of me, I guess. So first we look at the sample characteristics by race and income, since these are the factors that we're most concerned with here. So among the 25,000 respondents that we have, 12% of them, these are all percentages, 12% of them were black, another 12% Hispanic, 68% white, and everything else was Asian, mixed income, mixed race. And just a quick note, because it's well established that the Asian children have lower propensity towards obesity, less likely to be obese, less prevalence of obesity. That race group is simply omitted in this study because I'm trying to understand disparities between black, Hispanic, and white. For low income, 46% of the sample were low income, 54% for upper income. And so we've got some devastating news, folks, but this is similar to what other studies have shown, but the black children in this, 43% of the black children in the sample were either overweight or obese, 43%. Hispanic children at 37%, and nearly half of the percentage for black children, 26% of the white children were overweight or obese. So for low income, we see very similar patterns. 38% were overweight or obese versus 23% for upper income. And then the general population, or the sample, 30% was overweight obese. So these next two lines are not necessarily relevant for this study, but I saw something interesting that I just want to point out for maybe a future study. And does anyone see a pattern? Anyone see something that might be interesting there? Yes.
Among the Hispanics and the whites, the girls are much less likely to be obese than the boys.
And even among all race and income groups, except for the black group. So it seems like they are less likely to be obese if you're in any other income or race group, but the black girls seem to be just as likely to be obese or overweight as their male counterparts. So that was something that was interesting. Again, not part of this particular study, but so we might want to look into that and understand maybe some cultural differences between race groups there, and understanding why, for whatever reason, all the other girls are lighter than in weight than the black girls. Okay. So we talked about obesity. Now the second dependent variable we had here is exercise, physical activity. And so another pattern sort of, we see that 88% of the black, Hispanic, and low income children exercise at least once a week. And this variable is one, what happened with this variable, the parent or adult guardian was asked, how many times a week does your child exercise? And so I for this table, all I did was select the ones that said at least once a week, right? And so that's why we have such a high number. Even with this high number, there's still a disparity, right? If you run a t-test, this variable is these differences, are statistically significant. But so there still is disparity, and the higher you go, so if I were to have made this exercise at least 2 days a week, we would see an even greater disparity, and not just a 4 percentage point difference, right? We would see something greater. But I just left it as is. Okay, correlation coefficients. So we're going to get a little deeper. We're going to keep getting deeper until we're finally done. So the first thing to point out here with these correlation coefficients is, again, not necessarily part of the study, but it was interesting to note that, before I even talk about this, let me just say that when I first did this analysis, I did it as a whole. I did the entire sample. And then something hit me one day, and I had a light bulb, and it said, separate it. Look at urban and look at rural and see if there are any differences in the disparity. And so rather than looking at just the whole group of 25,000 people, I separated the data sets and looked at urban and looked at rural. And so what we're going to talk about from here out are the differences, are what's happening in the urban setting, what's happening in the rural setting. Do they look the same? Okay, so the first thing we see here with these correlation coefficients is that they're, so black and Hispanic are more likely to be poor than their counterparts, or said a different way, poor people are more likely to be black or Hispanic. And this is less pronounced in the rural setting with these lower numbers, but it's still a disparity. So black people are definitely still more likely. And what we're seeing with all these stars or asterisks is that it's statistically significant at the 99.9% confidence level. So we are able to generalize beyond this sample to the population. So yeah, black people, Hispanic people are more likely to be poor. So when we're talking about poor, we might also be talking about race as well. Research question 1. Do the built-in social environments differ across race and income groups? Well, let's take a look. So the first two are the social environments, and we look at cohesion there. These numbers are negative, whether in urban or rural settings, and we can see that Black people and Hispanic people, as well as poor people, are less likely to have neighborhood cohesion. And these numbers are lower in the rural setting, so we can see that, again, less pronounced in the rural setting. Detractions, feeling unsafe. And we see that the Black positive numbers, so we see that Black, Hispanic, and lower income people are more likely to have these social detractions. Physical detractions, dilapidated housing, graffiti, and so on, we see, if I didn't already mention it, again, more pronounced in the urban setting than in the rural setting. And then the disparity, again, exists in greater volume, I guess, in the urban setting, but the detractions are more in among Black, low-income, and Hispanic children. And so then we get to this one, which threw me for a loop a little bit, because you would think that these disadvantaged groups would have less amenities, right? Just like they had less social amenities, cohesion. You would expect that. So let's look at the poor one, which is what, as was expected, and whether in rural or urban setting, they equally say the same thing, that there are poor and low income children are less likely to have amenities, right, than their more affluent counterparts. But then we look over at Black and Hispanic, and they are, at least in the urban setting, they're saying that, and it's a very small number, right? So, but they're saying that they are more likely, or they're reporting higher amenities. So there's a number, and they're reporting higher amenities than their white counterparts. And so it makes you think, well, why? And this data set is all about perception. This data set is all about, it's self-reported, so it's not objectively collected neighborhood environment measures. And so that plays a role here in your interpretation of this. And so, as I'm trying to make sense of it, is it that in these communities, I might have a sidewalk, it might be a makeshift sidewalk, but I'm selecting, yes, I have a sidewalk, right? It might be a gravel road over to the side. But I'm still selecting that, right? And it might be that in urban settings, which have, at least in this sample, more of the Hispanic and Black population, and literature confirms, and actually this study also confirms, that the urban setting does have more physical amenities than the rural setting. So if they have more physical amenities in the urban setting, and there are more Black and Hispanic people in the urban setting, then that kind of makes sense, sort of, right, that this physical amenities value is higher for the Black and Hispanics because they're living in these settings that have more amenities, regardless of the condition those amenities might be in, right? But technically they have it. And so on the flip side, though, an upper income or their white counterparts might say, you know what, there's cracks all in this road, no, don't have that. Or I don't remember the last time that pool was cleaned in the rec center, nope, don't have that either. And so I mean, these are all, speculations, but, as you're trying to make sense of this, these are the thoughts that come through my mind. Okay. We're almost there, folks. So the logistic regression model here, it just kind of goes a little deeper in telling us what's happening between the races and obesity. So the odds of being obese these numbers are indicating that the odds of being obese is 120% higher for Black children than for white children, 79% higher for Hispanic children than for white children. That number that disparity is less in the rural setting, but it's still a disparity. 119% higher odds of being obese than whites, and 41% higher odds of being obese for Hispanics. Model 2 looks at, so Model 1 only looked at the race variables. Model 2 looks at only the income variables, and we're seeing the same thing. So 108% higher odds of being obese if you're low income, and 71, so about a 30-point difference there between urban and rural, but it's still a disparity. All right, so research question 2. Are environmental factors associated with obesity, this obesity disparity? Well, let's take a look. So I failed to mention, but these are odds ratios, and a number 1 or higher means a positive relationship. A number lower than 1, so all these fractions we're seeing, 0.9 and so on, that's a negative relationship. So it's telling us that physical amenities, the more physical amenities you have, what would you guess that means? Right, so the more physical amenities you have, the lower your likelihood of being obese, right? Because that's the dependent variable here. The more cohesion you have, same thing, the less likely you are to be obese. And so that's those two. And then for the detractions, these are positive numbers since it's greater than 1. So the more detractions you have, be it physical or social, the more likely you are to be obese. And again, you see these stars telling us that what we're seeing in the sample exists beyond this sample to the population from which it came from. Okay? And we're also seeing that these numbers are more, the physical and social environments actually, well, not for cohesion, but at least for the detractions, they play a bigger role in understanding obesity than in the rural setting. So in the urban setting, these factors are a lot more important. Research question number 3, our last question. So if all else is equal, if all race and income groups have the same environments, would non-white and low-income children still have worse health outcomes? Well, so essentially what we did is the many people in my brain, what we did is we put all the variables together, the demographic variables, the neighborhood factors, and if we held all these neighborhood factors constant, which is what this model is doing, then what do we see? We still see high numbers. We still see greater than 1 numbers for race and income. So rather than what it was before holding neighborhood constant, I think it was 120. So the number for where it says 2.14 was actually 2.20. So the neighborhood factor decreases once it's all set even and we're all in the same playing field. All it does is decrease it, right, from 120 to 114. So 6 points. So it's doing something, but that's just telling us that there's more other things that might need to help bring that down, or maybe it's just the fact that you are black, right, and or Hispanic or low income, but those numbers went down, just not enough to balance it out, okay? And so in the rural setting, though, it balanced it out. So in the rural setting, we see that these numbers, the neighborhood factors, relatively the same, but there are no stars beside black and Hispanic anymore. That means it's not statistically significant. And when something's not significant, that means there is no relationship, right? That means that, for my stats students, right, that we fail to reject the null hypothesis, so we say that there is no relationship between between race and obesity when these factors are held, when everyone has the same environment. So, but what still stands there? Income. Income is still a factor. So income has come down a lot. You know, I think it was 172 or something like that when it was in its standalone model. But now holding it constant, we see that it's gone down to only 39% from 73% or something like that. So if we all have the same environment, then in the rural setting, not in the urban setting, in the rural setting, if we give everyone the same environment, the same amenities, remove all these detractions, then race doesn't play a role. Black people and white people, Hispanic people and white people are now on the same playing field, and they have the same likelihood of being obese. But low-income children are still more likely than their upper-income counterparts. And since I started off talking about physical activity, I did run that, and it was OLS regression models, which is what we learned in our stats class. And so the first three models that we saw in the previous slide showed very similar results for exercise or physical activity. This fourth model, though, is different from what we're seeing here with the fourth model for obesity. So I thought it was important to sort of point out what's happening here. So in the urban setting, what do we see? Any takers? Stats students? Any takers? Justin, you know? Yeah? Anne, you gonna give it a go? Oh, okay, Adriana? Nope? All right, well, we'll just go for it. When we hold all this stuff constant, right, and they are still significant, so when we hold them constant, what it's telling us is that income no longer matters in the urban setting. The disparity between Hispanic and whites is no longer a disparity. But black and white, there's still something happening there. And so black children are less likely to engage in physical activity than their white counterparts. Even when we give them all the same environment. And then we look at the urban setting, and so again, and this is very low significance because it's 90% confidence, so there's a 10% level of error that we're dealing with now versus 99.9% confidence. But this is still telling us that black race in terms of Hispanic and income is not playing. We are able to balance the playing field if we give them the same environment. But blacks still, even in the rural setting, are less likely to engage in physical activity. So another thing to mention here, though, is that it's telling us that physical amenities are no longer important. And if you throw everything in the model, physical amenities in a rural setting might not be as important. Detractions may not necessarily exist in those settings that way, and so they're not important. So what is most important and highly significant in the rural setting is cohesion. So, and if cohesion is the same, even if cohesion is the same, blacks are less likely to engage in physical activity, and then Hispanics and low income are now leveled. All right, so quick summary. Do the environments differ by race and income? Answers? Absolutely they do. And so both built-in physical and social environments are worse, if you will, for black, Hispanic, and low-income children, particularly in the urban setting, especially, even when things are balanced out and evened out, we still see issues there. Are environmental factors associated with disparities? Answers? Yes. Absolutely, yet again. And this is what we saw. For the most part, we saw that the more amenities and the more cohesion you had, the higher your physical activity level, the lower your likelihood to be obese. But detractions, whether physical or social, decrease your likelihood to engage in physical activity, increase your likelihood for obesity. And then, would having similar environments stabilize disparity?
Not quite.
You guys are listening to me. So not a little, right? So environmental factors, they do decrease the role that race and income play in physical activity and obesity among children, but they don't dissolve the issue. They don't dissolve the deeply rooted race and income disparities in the U.S., particularly in the urban setting, right, where they are more heavily concentrated anyway. So we've got some work to do, and it can start with, I'm preempting myself, but it can start with the environmental factors, whether physical or social, but it has to start somewhere. All right, so quick study limitations. This study, we can't talk about causation, we can't infer causality, only association. So I'm not saying that this causes that, right? I'm just saying that there's it's associated with it. Self-reported data, sort of talked about that earlier, can lead to under-reporting, over-reporting, generally speaking, from studies. In the literature, it sort of balances itself out. It auto-corrects itself, if you will. Subjective measures may come from personal interpretations and definitions of any of these variables that we talked about. So what is safe, right? Safe for one person might be different for safe from another person. Amenities, right? You might need to, going to the last bullet there, objectively obtain these neighborhood measurements and physical activity, because even that is based on recollection. And so you know, might not get the most accurate information, but again, self-reported data based on the research tends to balance its own self out. And then not only getting objectively obtained measures, but doing so for a certain group over a period of time, just to see if we do bring in some, better programs for them or improve sidewalks or add facilities, what's the change? What's the difference? What happens? Okay, so policy implications in terms of targeted assistance for underserved race and income groups, for underserved disadvantaged communities, interventions and policy changes towards the built environment, social environments, urban settings where disparities we saw are the greatest. And then future studies might include the not just outside the home, but inside the home, what's happening inside, cultural background, particularly as I mentioned with the gender difference that we saw, and then nutrition, and there's lots of different things we can throw into this pot and see what happens. And I think that's it. Hold on, let me make sure. Yes, that's it. And so I wanted us to talk during the discussion. Feel free to ask questions, of course, of anything that wasn't clear, but also for us to think about what some policy implications might be along these bulleted lines or outside of that. Thank you so much. Okay, Wanda?
Okay, Dr. Uzuchukwu, I just think that when you making policy or doing studies, yeah, they are helpful, and I'm not discrediting that, but I also think that the biggest thing has nothing to do with race. It's merely about, when it comes to your obese study, is available money put to food. Because if you paying a high rent and you don't have access to healthy food, that wasn't a factor that you considered to me.
So you're talking about the nutrition, the very last one?
Yeah, nutrition.
I agree.
Not only nutrition, you include the low income, but the low income affects the nutrition. You understand what I'm saying? Make sense?
Ramen noodles, frozen pizza.
Yeah, like that. And you know, so it don't matter. It doesn't matter how much a person exercises if you're not eating the right kinds of things.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? You just gonna be like unhealthy. So you didn't. I don't think that you. I'm not gonna say. I think that should be considered.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you. Yes. Lori, Dr.
I just
Naylor.
wanted to say, one, you're absolutely right, because it's, when you look at it, it's body weight, it's about 75% food intake and 25% physical activity. But a bigger question I have is, when you looked at defining rural versus urban,
Mhm.
was there a certain
It's my question
overall,
too.
I try to get a handle in terms of like what percentage of US population lives in urban centers, what percent lives in suburbia, and what percent lives in rural, and then how do they define that? Because people's description of rural varies widely. I grew up in a town of about 10, 12,000 people. Somebody else I know grew up in a town like 500, so they thought I was living in a city.
Nah.
I was living out by Dodge City, right? So I just kind of wonder how they define that, what it looks like to them.
So in the data set, and I believe I just used it as is. Let me make sure. Inside the MSA and outside the MSA. And so anything inside I considered urban. Probably was suburban, some of it is what I wrote here. But I just to, have some binary variable and not this third thing I wanted to. So I just, and honestly, I couldn't create a third thing just because it was already created as a binary variable for me, or dummy variable. Sorry, folks. Yeah.
Okay.
So inside MSA and outside MSA. Yeah. Yes.
I think Wanda made a good point when she mentioned getting access to nutrition and things like that. One of the things that I was thinking of during your presentation was the presence of food deserts. So even if you're living in a city, like I know in my case, I live downtown, but the closest grocery store to me is all the way in Federal Hill, and I don't feel like always having to hike over there
Yeah.
to go grocery shopping, but I do. So I can imagine somebody else being like, I guess we do circumstances, and maybe they're working 2 jobs and have to take the bus or
Yeah.
something, making a hike to go to the grocery store to get food, even though they live in a city.
Yeah, because it doesn't matter how much you exercise if you don't eat healthy.
Yeah,
You know what I'm saying? Because you still want to be like unhealthy. So
exactly.
it doesn't matter whether you exercise every day, shuttling them buses and walking them blocks. That's exercise.
Yeah.
So Tobias and then Ann.
I was just gonna ask also about the difference, the cutoff between urban
Oh, okay.
and rural, and whether the kind of strange results that you saw in terms of correlation between positive amenities and minority population could be caused by that, partly because you're measuring things like sidewalks, which often aren't around in suburbs, if those are being counted as part of the urban area.
Urban amenities.
Yeah. So that's not. I can't get that level of detail, but yeah. So it does play a role. And
And to piggyback off of what Monique was saying, I would also add that the amount of time somebody has to commute to work and whether they have access to a car or whether they have to rely on mass transit. Because if they're spending an hour and a half just in one direction commuting, they might not actually have the time to cook. It's easier to pick up.
yeah,
To go.
agreed. Justin.
No, I would just say I would go back to one of the earlier slides about the physical amenities. Because it's kind of, they're pretty much not relevant in the urban communities anymore. Most of the time that the physical amenities are normally bought by the people in the community. But that tends to attract more criminal mischief or criminal behavior. So that kind of leads to the unsafe surroundings, I guess that's what we call it.
Yeah.
So it just, I just want to know how accurate could those numbers really be with.
Well, it's as accurate as self-reported information can be. Yeah. So, but understanding and okay, so understanding sort of the data before us, right, and some of the findings that we have, and coming from a planning department profession where I dealt with transportation a lot and dealt with having to improve the physical environment, and that was our focus, right? I wasn't in the health department. And so that is really where this is coming from, and that is how access to this data came about. And so with that understanding, with the understanding that we've gotten from this talk, I'm wondering what we could do in the planning world, right? What would, Heather?
Yes. I like it. So far I've enjoyed everybody's presentation.
Yeah.
No offense for those being there, there are
Yeah, yeah.
tractors if you're trying to develop arbories and things of that sort. But we need more Aldis going up.
Yep.
Yes.
We need more Safeways going up.
Yeah,
And,
Or like
grocery
shoppers.
stores that have expanded going up in our communities, and that's one thing we really do have to address, you know, here in the surrounding area. I know we've had farmers markets and groups that we've worked with for, time and time again here and there, and they've cropped up all over, and that's been great, but they're not always around. We have our old, Arabers, right? You know, familiar, I saw one not too long ago, you know what I'm talking about, the guys with the fruit.
The-
Am I saying the name wrong?
Arabs.
Arabs.
You talk Arabs. Come from the horse and carriage.
Yeah, the horse.
Well,
and
they-
I haven't seen it.
produce.
Oh.
You'll see it
Very limited.
Yeah,
And
I
they
was
only
like,
do
yeah, every
basketball.
now and then you're
Yeah.
gonna come across somebody, at least once or twice, you
They
know.
used to be prevalent. In the
Yes,
70s,
yes,
they
they
were
used to
prevalent.
deliver produce
That's how
throughout
we
the
got our,
community.
that's how we got, cause see, I'm from Baltimore and,
Yeah.
47 years. And so they used to come around on Saturdays, and mainly when people come, had, get their food stamps, or they cash assistance, and that's how we had access to fresh produce, fresh, fruit, and, they sell it abundantly.
And bringing something back like that and investing in small core and things like that is another, unique, way to think about it as well. And I think the city, there are a variety of different ways we can think about it. I'm even happy about UB now having a food pantry.
I know.
Yeah.
Every school here, every K through 12 and every college here should have a food pantry. But those are just my.
Thank you. Other thoughts before we?
And just going off the other comment, just please can we have grocery stores within walking distance of, where people live instead of being spread out and such. I feel like finding a grocery store is really hard.
Yeah.
I think
And the one that you do find is extremely expensive. So, Wanda?
So we're talking about policy, correct?
Sure.
Okay, so in policy, that's a bit of planning. You did a survey. So the people that need to be at the table having this conversation are often not at the table. So when you have in policy, I know this is, I don't think it's redundant because you can never emphasize the need for the people who have the need to be listened to first, because everybody can make policies about what they think something is due based on some numbers, but you can't let it be the end all be all or the Bible of that situation, because yes, that's data and it's supportive of some things, but it always, when I look at findings and data, it always like, well, we couldn't do this, but we could do this, and we could base all this off of this. You know what I'm saying? It's like little pockets of data that doesn't encompass the whole issue. You know what I'm saying? So it has limits. So I just say that upon making policy, that I think it needs to be more detailed of if you're researching a particular community or particular people that it'll be, I don't wanna say intrusive, but yeah, intrusive, you know
What?
what I mean?
You mean the data collection would be intrusive?
I think it needs to be more.
Oh, you think it needs
I
to be
think it
more?
needs to be, to get the real feel of it, because I just think that when people collect data,
Inclusive?
yeah.
Oh,
No, or
inclusive.
intrusive too, because.
Okay. Okay.
Intrusive and intrusive.
Okay.
Because I say intrusive because self-reporting, yeah, but ask the very hard questions that sometimes make people, because sometimes people lie. You know what I'm saying? So, and then they always want to make their position not seem that bad or better than what it is, so you have to factor in all of that. So I think that when upon making policies based on data, I think that data shouldn't be the end all.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about this in class, right? I mean, there's importance of data, but sometimes the data isn't there, and action still needs to be made. And sometimes the data that is there because, maybe someone is trying to push a particular agenda, might say something different from what actually needs to happen.
Yeah.
So data can work for and against you. Julian and then Dr. Naylor.
So, just kind of to take Wanda's like concept a little further, it's like I agree with most everything she said, but I think it's also looking at things more comprehensively. People are doing like this self-reporting. Like someone's actually gathering this information, but then you go into translating that into policy. From this data, I also feel like maybe what Wanda's saying is that the voices are just being used for this specific thing, as opposed to saying, okay, now that you've given this information and you start reporting about the quality of life that you're living, you know, hey, you come to this public forum, come to this meeting and say, okay, hey, how can I influence those things? And I don't think it's necessarily the people who are living it, it's just the fact that if they aren't afforded that opportunity.
Okay,
And I
yeah.
think it's often that
Not to the extent, excuse me,
No,
not
no,
to the
you're-
extent
that they
that they
should.
need to be,
They should,
you know.
absolutely. Because, you know, you could easily ask all of us in our government and public policy class, how do we feel about something on campus? And then you're going to sit with the president smoking, and you're kind of like, okay, I've gathered all this information, as opposed to saying, okay, hey, I have this meeting on the 21st of November. Hey, let's go and sit down together as a class with, you know, President Spoke. You know, I think that's often where you see where you said that it can be helpful and hurtful at the same time. Because it's helpful for the ones collecting the data, but then when you're translating into policy, I feel like maybe sometimes it's kind of like the game telephone. Hey, this is what's happening. Hey, this is what's going on. And then as you give it to the intermediate, as they take it to the next source, it's kind of like being lost or, oh, it isn't that bad. And again, like Wanda said, people will lie to make their situations not seem as bad. But then the person who's receiving information and receiving that is like, oh, okay, well, they're okay. So I just think being mindful, because if you look at everything
How do you
comprehensively,
meet that?
yeah, like if you look at everything comprehensively, like everything that you touched on, from you know how often people walk. I mean, if people walk to and from school in correlation to obesity. Sometimes sometimes that's the only option people have, whereas sometimes people don't have those options, but it's a safety aspect that also goes into why they don't walk to and from school. So I think being more tactful and being more mindful of everywhere. Like I think Crescendo earlier said, having more grocery stores and walking areas. Sometimes, space is available for those things, but then it's also like, okay, hey, let's create policies that we can create some of these, some of these, abandoned spaces we can turn into, a healthy, fresh food source for the community.
Yeah, I just want to add, if you go into some of the other disciplines for literature, if you go into medicine and public health, what we know, this is going to sound really odd, but I'll explain it, and it is very simple, is what they found, there was a really, the New England Journal of Medicine, was like the gold standard in medicine in terms of publications. What they found, and it sounds odd, but they found that obesity is infectious. What they do, and this goes into social networking, some of the work that probably Dr. Walkhouse does, but if you look at social networking, what we know, it doesn't matter where you live in the country, doesn't matter if it's urban or rural, but your body weight is more directly tied to those individuals that you feel emotionally connected to. So example, if your mother lives in Atlanta, or you have a sister that you are really connected to who's out in Los Angeles, they've been able to go in and look at your social network, and what they know is that your body weight is highly, highly correlated to the people you feel most emotionally connected to. We always talk about how food is one of those cultural things. My family is a bunch of foodies. We grill out steak, we eat all kinds of food. And if you come to the table, you choose one little salad, they're going to provoke you. We're eating a salad, we're steak people. But there's considerable evidence to show that our body weight is highly connected to those individuals we have emotional ties to. I think that came out maybe 5 or 6 years ago, but that's where they were leading in that direction in terms of medicine and public health. Is how do we go into those social networks and actually do something in that arena. And I don't know what the answer is, but that's kind of where they were at the time. Whatever it's worth.
These are all good thoughts. Good thoughts. Other thoughts, questions? Megan?
I think one thing when we talk about nutrition and obesity, especially in urban areas, is I don't know, I could be wrong, but I've never seen a lot of green spaces in Baltimore. There isn't really, there's one by like Hopkins where they use for football practice, and it's still really small, but there aren't any playgrounds. and socialize as a group. And I think that hurts you mentally and physically.
Back then, but it didn't always used to be like that. We did have playgrounds.
Oh,
we
I'm not
did have
saying you
open
never
spaces.
did.
But because of gentrification and dilapidated neighborhoods and people and white flight and all those kind of issues, that's what you see now. And under Stephanie Rawlings Blake authority, it has gotten worse. It didn't even used to be that when she took office. We still had a little viability in the city until she became mayor.
No, that's why I mentioned it as
Yeah, it
a
didn't always
policy
be like
issue.
that. Yeah, it
Yeah.
didn't always be
It-
like that.
Exactly, it hasn't always been. There is a chance for it to get better.
Yeah.
But I think policy has to be in place.
And
for
jobs
that.
and money.
Yeah, and so I don't remember Monday when the folks from planning came and talked about, well, we had a leader that wanted this, and so that's why it got pushed. That leader is no longer here, so that thing is no longer getting pushed. And so as you talk about policy and the politics behind it, you need the right leader. You need the leader that says green space is important, because that's the only way it's going to get done, right? So completely agree. Julian, you had your hand up?
No, I didn't forget. I'm trying to delicately go about this.
Get right to it. Just.
We all adults here.
Rip off the Band-Aid.
That's an excuse. Like what she says is an excuse because people who want to go outside and play and use their neighborhood and communities, they do. And I mean, it's kind of both aspects kind of touch. Like I see error, kind of, sort of, in both statements. Because example being, someone who lives on the Trophone projects, they have a small little basketball court there, and you will see that place flooded with 50 men playing basketball in rotation. So it's not necessarily about having the green space. You know, Dunbar's football field is right there. I went to Dunbar. I know that they keep it open for the community sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes the opportunity is there. It's not necessarily based off of the people. Sometimes it's based off of the safety and security that one feels in their community. And particularly that area some people may not believe it's the safest. But to say, yeah, we used to have playgrounds, yes. Do we still have playgrounds? Yeah, we do, but they're not in quote unquote safe places. So if we're gonna look at having the space to be active, we have to also look at the other components that go into it. You know, everybody's not gonna be able to pay for Planet Fitness membership or YMCA membership. No, they have to use the resources they have available. People are, waiting from month to month to get government assistance. All that stuff doesn't
The
matter.
last thing on their mind
Is
is a
the YMCA, some kind, exactly.
and that's what
I mean, some
you
people
trying
sit there,
to
and also you have to look at someone who is walking to and from work, to and from school, whatever. By the time they get home from whatever they have to do, they may be obese. They're gonna sit up there, and like I said earlier, eat ramen noodles and a frozen pizza and call it a day. You're not gonna worry about I'm gonna pay for this later. No.
green vegetables.
Right. So if we're gonna look at it from a policy standpoint, there are the myriad of issues that need to be addressed before you even get down to that are so far. Because safety, you're talking about, proper lighting for the appropriate times of the day, making sure that there's enough police on the streets, whatever. That's the reality of it. I mean, honestly, all of this is great. The presentation and the information is very valid, but everything else has to be addressed first. Like, honestly, comparatively to all the other issues that are here in Baltimore that affect this, this is the last one.
So,
But that's part of the discussion.
Right.
That's part of, okay, well, what does it mean to fix a built environment? What does it mean to fix a social environment, right? And so we can't continue to cut certain programs that are needed for your social well-being, your mental state, right? Or for the for the family to be intact, right? And so yeah, I mean, I think that this opens the door to start talking about all of these other things, and not necessarily that well, let's leave this alone and start talking about this is part of that, right? It's all interconnected, and whether it's from nutrition or these food deserts, and I mean it's all intertwined. So we can't like I tell my stats class, even though there are variables that you put in, there's so many other things that are playing a role, and so we can and we can control for these things, but what might be affecting that thing that we're controlling for? You know what I mean? So this is And so as we talk about these health and all policy, initiatives where you have to think about the health of the least of these when you're making policies, creating policies and implementing them, that's what's important. You can't just say we need to put a sidewalk there. What does that sidewalk actually, what does that mean, right? We have to, or we need to get rid of the school because of this, or we need to add the school because of this. What does all that mean to the least of these? So, we're gonna have one more question, two, okay. Wanda and then Tobias can close this out.
So, when discussing urban, any given situation, I believe that it should ultimately, the conversation should ultimately begin with economics. Because when you put money into, allow people to make money, they change their lives. You know what I'm saying? And it changes lives. Money gives you access to things that you wouldn't ordinarily have access to if you're living urban, concentrated, poor. So I'm not saying take a issue and throw money at it. Allow people to be able to make money. They will make better choices because they will have access. When you know better, you do better. And sometimes you can't fix everybody, but I just think it starts economically. Like giving people enough money to not just live but to thrive.
Right.
So with that being the foundation, I believe that people will make better food choices. When you trying to survive and pay your rent and feed your children, you have this little bit of money, and it takes a lot of ingenuity. It takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of mind stuff. When you trying to figure out how you're going to feed a family of off of this little bit of money. So I think that should be the foundation economically. Give people enough, more than give people a living wage so they can thrive. And when you take all the stresses off of how I'm gonna do this or how I'm gonna do this, and you have the money to do that, you don't have to buy people to pay Paul. Even in the low wage situation, just because I work at McDonald's, I'm not supposed to be able to live. Now I'm not gonna say wealthy, but just to live. You know what I'm saying? Like if I feel like I wanna go to the store and buy a gallon of milk and a loaf of bread and a meal for my family, that's not gonna break my bank, break my pockets. So I think that's where it's just called. When you're making policy should include living ways. See, nobody wants to do that. Nobody wants to do that. They be like, oh, it's gonna hurt my pockets, it's gonna raise this and that.
Tobias.
It's so old.
So I'm kind of coming back to your initial research questions on whether built and social environments impact obesity outcomes and whether minorities still have worse outcomes if we control for those and if we control for income status. And so it sounds like the answers to those all were yes, and maybe a little bit of a qualified yes in terms of the impact of race once we control for income. That did seem to at least be a factor for the African American community. And so my question is, A, whether you were able to quantify what amount of that impact came from those different sources, like what
within the built environment, was it sidewalks? Was it
No. So what amount of the increased prevalence in obesity was caused specifically by race as opposed to income, as opposed to built versus social environments?
Yeah.
So
So this slide.
So here I see the different correlations, right?
No, these aren't
But
correlations.
or the odds ratios.
Okay.
But are you able to say this percent of the increased prevalence of being overweight or obese was caused by the built environment versus by low income status versus this amount we can't explain and seems to be
Not from these models.
okay.
Now you can look at the models and see the the number difference, but even that is, might be deceiving just because these aren't standardized numbers.
Okay.
And so we would want to look at standardized numbers that should, you know, because right now, Black, Hispanic, and low income, these numbers are you're comparing apples and oranges. But if we put it all in a standard form, like beta weights or something like that, which I don't know that you're familiar with, but then we can say, okay, this is having this percentage, or this amount of impact versus this versus that. So that's not here. That is something I could include in the analysis, and that's actually, I think, a good point. But,
Okay.
yeah.
Because I've just been feeling like that would be helpful in terms of kind of informing a policy discussion to be able to say, well, it looks like the biggest contributor is X, so let's try to tackle that
Well,
first.
I mean, if we're looking at these numbers though, I mean, this is that 2.14, that's 114%, versus if you look at any of the neighborhood factors, that's only 10% for physical amenities.
Mhm.
So 10% of what is explaining obesity is coming from the amenities, where you see this 114, that's like,
Mhm.
you know, so we
And-
can see that, but that's not the proper way of interpreting those
Mhm.
numbers.
Yeah, so then like my question is also like how much of that 114% is explained by the 82% in the low income category? Because there's
Oh, yeah, but,
like,
so that's
like
funny.
trying to tease
because-
those apart.
So I actually do, it's funny, because I do that in the study, and I have interaction terms that do exactly what you're talking about.
Okay.
So I actually do that, and I just can't tell you off the top of my head what those are, but no, it's not here. But I do that. I
Okay.
do tease out, and I do a lot of interaction throughout the model, but I didn't want to include that for you guys, because that's not,
Sure.
you know,
Sure.
you have to sort of read that, because it's a lot.
Do you have kind of a bird's eye view takeaway of what stood out as the most?
I think what stands out to me is that urban settings have the greatest disparity when you look at urban and rural. And the second thing is that even when these neighborhood factors are, you know, everyone is on the same playing field, race and income still play a pretty big factor, right? And so those are the two things, if I were to walk up to someone, those are the two things I would tell them. So the issue becomes, well, since it's not the built environment or the social environment, then what is it about race? Is it just simply race? Because it's playing pretty huge role. So, you know, and we try to tease it out and say, well, maybe it's the environment. Well, we just saw the environment plays a role, just not that big a role. It doesn't cancel out the issue of I'm still Black, the issue of I'm still low income, right? So I would start there with those two things.